From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is the story on Sunday. I'm Manveen Rana. This weekend on the podcast and across the Times, we're marking 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. Yesterday, we heard how modern America was forged through revolution and war. But for the Native Americans, that history reads differently.
David Madeira Sr., he's 80 years old and he lives on the Spokane Reservation. He told me that because of the shame that he was given and that he grew up with, when he was a kid, he'd go to the cinema and he'd watch cowboys and Indians films and he'd cheer for the cavalry.
For centuries, their cultures have been pushed to the margins. Children taken from their families, languages banned, and traditions forced underground.
As I was reporting the story, when I was speaking to non-Native Americans, people would say things like, "Oh, are they still here?"
The Sunday Times senior US correspondent Louise Callahan has been to visit a family who are striving to change that.
I spent some time with the Madeira family, who are raising their children in their culture, with their ceremonies, with their language. All of that was pretty much illegal until 1978.
But that revival has exposed a deeply contested question. After centuries of displacement, assimilation, and intermarriage, who actually gets to call themselves Native American? And how should that be determined? The story today: who still counts as Native American in 2026?
So it's the 250th anniversary of the United States. And when I was thinking about how I wanted to cover it, I was talking to my editors, and one thing that came up was, what is life like for Native Americans today? And once my editor asked me the question, I realised that I didn't really know. And I think that's pretty normal for people in the US. As I was reporting the story, when I was speaking to non-Native Americans, people just had absolutely no idea. People would say things like, "Oh, are they still here?"
Wow.
Right. I really think that it's a subject which is so unexplored in the US today. People learn a bit in the school about the wars in the mid to late 19th century between settlers and the cavalry and Native Americans, but there's so little focus on what it's actually been like since then for Native Americans.
So in order to find out, just describe where that story takes you.
So I went to Washington State. That's right out in the west of the US. And I went to an area around a city called Spokane. I ended up focusing on the school called the Salish School of Spokane. I cannot describe to you how extraordinary this place is. About 10 years ago, this language, Colvin Okanagan Salish, which is one of the many Salish languages which are in the west of the US, it was going extinct. And today, there are only 2 native speakers of Colvin Okanagan Salish alive. 2. But this school, the Salish School of Spokane, has got this immersion program. The people who run the school, Lorraine Wiley and her husband Chris, Lorraine Wiley is from this tribe, the Colville tribe. She wanted to save the language because she was going to these funerals all the time and just watching her elders die and realizing that her language was just disappearing. So they moved into the houses of one of the last native speakers of the language, learnt the language over 2 years, and then started the school. And in this school, then there's dozens of students, and there's all the teachers and the parents of the students. They all have to learn this language. what's amazing to me is that they speak this language that was almost extinct. They don't just speak it at events or during ceremonies, or they speak it every day. They're at basketball practice speaking this language, which almost went completely extinct. So for me, that was kind of my entry point into the story, was this extraordinary look at language revitalization, because the more I looked into it, it became so clear that one of the ways that the US government tried to destroy Native American tribal system, the communities, the culture, was by taking away their language. And then so bringing it back as this extraordinary act of reclaiming who they are.
You spoke to some of the pupils there, some of the families attached to the school. Tell us about one family in particular who you spent some time with.
I spent some time with the Madera family, who have 6 kids who are all at the school. And the parents, Tommy and Dakota, are both teachers there. At home, in their completely normal house in a completely normal suburb of Washington State, they speak Culven and Salish all the time with their kids, and the kids are like making burritos, eating pizza, talking this language. And what was so extraordinary to me is that, I mean, in a way, it's just a completely normal household scene, right, from the outside. Then if you think about the history of what happened to Native American people in the US, what Tommy and Dakota are doing, raising their children in their culture, with their ceremonies, with their language, going every weekend to powwows, which are these meetings where Native Americans come together. All of that was pretty much illegal until 1978. Not 1878, 1978. It was Jimmy Carter who passed the law making it legal to live as a Native American.
And Louise, as you say, that broader history of America and how it's dealt with its Native American population, whether it's that Jimmy Carter moment, everything that came before it, it has such a huge impact on the way individuals live. And you can see it in the generations of this one family. So just tell us about one of the elders in the family who you met. Just tell us a bit about him. Who is he and what is he like?
David Madera Sr. is Dakota's grandfather. He's 80 years old and he lives on the Spokane Reservation, which is about an hour outside Spokane, an hour away from Dakota's suburban home. As a child on the reservation, he was growing up sort of at the tail end of the boarding school era, where people that he knew were sent to boarding school, but he was able to go to school on the reservation. One of the leaders of one of the boarding schools said that their strategy was kill the Indian in him, save the man. That was the idea. It was the idea that you had to drop everything about you that was Native American. You had to cut your hair, you had to wear a suit, you had to speak English. You were beaten for speaking your own language. His mum had been sent away to boarding school, where she'd been terribly, terribly beaten and mistreated and told not to speak her language. His mother and his grandmother both spoke Salish, but to protect him, they didn't teach it to him. So he's the first generation that doesn't speak Salish. When he was growing up on the reservation, he told me it was a very violent place. They had nothing. I mean, they're out in the woods. There's nothing around there. This is the land of his tribe. It's the land that his tribe owns. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of what they initially controlled, which was sold in the late 19th century to the US. It's in the middle of the forest. It's very, very beautiful, but there's nothing really there. There were very few jobs. The church was very dominant. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have plumbing. They lived mainly off deer meat. Alcoholism was incredibly prevalent. And we've seen in some of the primary sources from the late 19th century that the US had the strategy of giving out as much alcohol as they can to Native Americans on reservations and sort of watching as their culture disintegrated, but to try and break the fight in them was the idea. And so what David Madera grew up with was this shame where Native Americans like him, they were poor, there's nothing going for them. They were told that their culture was bad and they were beaten for speaking their language and worth nothing. So he told me that because of all of this, because of the shame that he was given and that he grew up with, he was ashamed to be Native American. He told me that when he was a kid, he'd go to the cinema and he'd watch cowboys and Indians films and he'd cheer for the cavalry. And that shame, I think, is something that so many people of his generation and subsequent generations have to some extent internalized.
And he described to you what the reservation was like when he grew up there. It sounded like quite a hopeless place. Did you go and visit it? I mean, what is it like now? And just describe what a reservation is for, British audiences. That alone is quite an odd idea.
In the mid-late 19th century, then the US had this policy of moving Native Americans onto reservations, which was these usually small, remote patches of land. So it was to break the resistance of the Indian Wars. The idea was that you could just kind of round Native Americans up, get them to stay on this reservation, and then settlers would be able to expand throughout the rest of the US and farm and settle wherever they wanted. So today, a reservation it looks like pretty much anywhere else. But there's usually signs saying, you're entering, in this case, you're entering Welpinit Reservation. It's in the forest. It's really, really beautiful. There's lots of kind of small houses. Here it's these little country lanes that go through the reservation. There's a shop, there's a school. It just looks like any other kind of nice small town in the forest. The only real sign that there's Native Americans living there specifically is the way that they teach kids in school. They have these kind of cultural aspect to it, religious aspects to it, and they have a language school there as well.
Did he tell you about his time at school? What was that like?
So he went to school on the reservation. People weren't allowed there to speak Salish. So it was, all the teachers were white. The focus was very much on Christianity, and it was about assimilating. It was about being like any other American.
So he and his son, so this is, a cross-generational thing, grow up not being able to speak the language. Now he has his grandchildren who are speaking it all the time. There's a school that his great-grandchildren are going to where that's how they're doing lessons. That's how they're learning. How does he feel about that?
I asked him about this. He told me, look, of course, I'm so happy for my great-grandkids. I'm happy for my grandson. They can grow up in this language, that they can live in their culture. They can do all these dances and ceremonies and everything that he was banned from doing. But he's also very sad that he never had that.
Coming up, what does being a Native American in 2026 actually look like? That's in just a moment. Louise, you've been telling us about the Madeira family and how you can have a completely different experience of being Native American now as opposed to a couple of generations ago. And yet, while you were looking at this subject, what's really fascinating and unexpected is just how even the question of who actually counts as Native American seems to be changing. Just explain what the difficulty is.
The question of who gets to be Native American is one that's really, really difficult to figure out. For so many reasons, because people were moved in the 19th century onto reservations. And once they were there, then life was really, really hard. And a lot of people left once the reservation era was kind of ending in favor of these policies from the US that you should assimilate. Then people were, in some cases, kind of forcibly pushed to move to cities, where they then lost their culture, became like just any other American. And then so trying to figure out kind of who actually gets to be Native American is pretty tough. And then so the US government introduced this system called blood quantum, which is used differently in every tribe, and some don't use it, but it's fairly common. And basically it's that on your tribal ID, you have this fraction, right, where it says how much blood, 1/4 or 1/8 or whatever, is Native American, and also what proportion of your blood is from the specific tribe. So it depends on the tribe. Some tribes, they count total Native American ancestry, some just count from the specific tribe. But yeah, so you get a card and it says, you've got 1/4 Spokane Salish blood. This is obviously incredibly controversial because there's a lot of people who maybe grew up really far away from the reservation, who have no connection to the land, and who have access to tribal rights, whether that's fishing or whether that's healthcare or whatever it is. Not that the Native American healthcare system is particularly great or enviable, but that there is some level of access to healthcare and sort of dividends from various businesses that the tribe engages in, right? Whether that's casinos or fishing or whatever. And then so there's this debate over who gets to call themselves that. Who gets that? Is it someone who grew up on the reservation but who might only have a Native American grandparent? Or is it someone who is half but who grew up in Oakland, California, really far away? What happens then when someone who grew up on the reservation and has 1/4, quote unquote, blood marries someone who doesn't have any? What if their children grew up on the reservation? Do they not get to be Native American anymore? It's really, really complicated, I think, and I think there's not really any easy answers. The system of blood quantum was designed with the idea by the federal government that eventually it would be diluted, quote unquote, and that then the US government would be able to get control over these resources that the tribes have. And so there's this system which in a way was designed to, mathematically speaking, destroy them, because of course you can't all just continue to have children within your own tribe. And then so it's just logically, the more time passes, the less power you will hold in your hands as a tribe as a result of this. But then also, I mean, what are you supposed to do? Just say that anyone who wants to be Native American can be Native American? That's also not going to work. It's a really complicated thing that tribes are trying to figure out at the moment.
And Louise, just clarify, what do you get for being Native American, apart from the ability to call yourself Native American? Are there particular rights? Are there particular dividends that you automatically benefit from?
Yeah, so it depends on the tribe, and I think there's a few exceptions where you get a lot. So, for example, the Seminole of Florida, they own the Hard Rock Cafe. That's quite significant. If you're an enrolled tribal member of the Seminole, you get fairly significant dividends every year from that business. There's tribes which have, I'm really against the odds, managed to make successful businesses, to use the resources on their lands, whether that's, mining or fishing or things like that, to make money. But I think for most tribes, the dividends are not particularly significant. You get some access to healthcare. There's a few other things that you get, but I think there's this incorrect and racist idea among many in the US that if you're Native American, you get kind of everything handed to you on a plate, which is just not true. The levels of poverty among Native Americans are far higher than for the average person in the US. And the access to resources is much, much lower.
And Louise, just the idea of a blood quantum is so bizarre. I can't imagine that happening to any other community or any other race in the world, of being told what fraction you are and whether that qualifies you. It's such an odd concept. I mean, how does that play out?
It's very contentious. I don't think anyone's happy with the system, really. Some other tribes don't use the blood quantum system, or they use it in conjunction with the tribal roles of names. When a reservation was created, then the US government would say, okay, well, there are 50 families living here and here are their names. We've registered them. So you can also use those. Are you part of this family? But then it was the US government who were busy trying to exterminate your people who decided who belonged on the reservation. So should you really take their word for it, that they were the people who really lived there or who were really part of the tribe? Maybe there were other tribal members who ended up on a different reservation. So it's just really, really difficult.
Well, in a way, I suppose that's the huge question I have, which is that if this really controversial system, the idea of a blood quantum, was introduced by the US government in order to try and dilute the tribes, in order to make them smaller, in order to almost sort of wipe out the identity of being a Native American, why are they still using that system?
I think no one's come up with a better one. I think there's just no perfect system. And that's really an indictment of, unfortunately, how effective the US government's campaign to try to eliminate Native American identity was, and makes it even more extraordinary that it still does exist today and that people are working so hard to try and keep it alive.
As well as the debate about who gets to call themselves a Native American, I suppose, what your reporting also highlights is just there's no such thing as a particular Native American experience. It's so varied. I mean, just give us a snapshot, give us a sense of how varied it is in modern life.
The Native American experience varies enormously across the US. So the people that I spoke to who are living in Spokane, Washington, their experience will be very, very different to the life of someone who's living in Arizona, for example. And so one really important dynamic that's at work here that I don't think I'd really fully appreciated before reporting on this is how the East Coast tribes, people like the Iroquois, for example, they were subject to extermination or disease or attacks from settlers much, much, much earlier than, for example, people living out west or in Arizona. For someone who has Iroquois ancestry, their relationship with that being much, much further away because their tribes were attacked and decimated a long time. When the first, British settlers are arriving on the coast centuries ago, then they were being impacted by them and measles and smallpox are spreading and the populations are being decimated. Whereas the tribes who are living out west had this completely different experience where the settlers were arriving much, much later during the gold rush in the mid to late 19th century. And so their experience is very different.
And as you described, there are clearly lots of misconceptions amongst a lot of Americans about what the modern Native American experience is. And, some are very successful, as you said, but there's also a lot of poverty. I mean, just talk us through the statistics on Native Americans.
Now, after centuries of repression from the US government, then Native Americans are nearly twice as likely to live in poverty or die by suicide as the average US citizen. To date, they have the lowest life expectancy of any ethnic group in the US. Native American men have a life expectancy of 67 years old, which is lower than the life expectancy in Ethiopia, and Pakistan, Malawi. And this is in the richest country on earth. Also, much more likely, 4 times as more likely to die from alcohol-related causes or live with a chronic disease. So there are these enormous, enormous difficulties.
Louise, having spent some time looking at this community that doesn't get very much coverage, and having spent time with a family in particular, with the Madeiras, when you came away from that, what were your impressions? What were the things that you'll never quite forget?
I think for me, what was initially so shocking was how recently it had been illegal as Native American to take part in your culture, your language. What's been so striking for me when I've been looking into this, which is something that Native Americans know very, very well, they have been repressed and oppressed on a completely different level and in a different way to other ethnic groups in the US. I spoke to this historian at Yale, a Native American guy, who was saying that for the US government, as America is being kind of formed as a modern nation in the wake of the Civil War and then into the 20th century, then Native Americans were used to represent something which was anti-American. This idea of savages and civilized people, cowboys and Indians, that they were sort of demonized as the opposite of all of this Enlightenment era thought that the US is supposedly based on, right? Freedom and liberty and justice, this idea that in the new world where you can come and leave everything behind and start a new life. Native Americans were shown incorrectly and painted in this way of being as the opposite of that. So Native Americans only gained automatic US citizenship in 1924. That's 56 years after the 14th Amendment established birthright citizenship for everyone born in the US, including freed slaves. Their experience of repression from the US government has just been really extreme. That's something I'll remember. But I think also the respect for the people that I met, how hard they're fighting to live in their culture with their language. Doing that is something so extraordinary. When you grow up, you're in poverty, surrounded by all this difficulty, you live on a remote reservation, and the people who are in charge have been trying to wipe out your culture and trying to make you assimilate for a very long time, that you can still make this decision to say, actually, no, I'm going to learn my language, I'm going to learn my culture, I'm going to live in this way. That's something really, really radical and extraordinary to me, and something that will stay with me for a while.
And finally, Louise, as America marks this anniversary, this 250 years of independence with fireworks and celebrations, they're marking the idea of America and what it was allowed to become as an independent republic, as a democracy with a constitution that enshrined equal rights for all of its citizens. How has this reporting trip made you reconsider the history of America and that image of what America is?
I think it's made me think a lot about what it came at the expense of. The US, as it is today, can only exist because of the destruction of Native American societies. A lot of Americans would say, well, that happened a long time ago and we just have to get over it and get on with life. But actually, Native Americans, they're not something of the past. They're not some people that had a war fought against them by the US, had their societies exterminated and went quietly away. They're an important part of American life today. They have ordinary jobs, they live ordinary lives, but they also celebrate their culture. And they survived. And they're still here today. And when I spoke to Tommy from the mother in the Madera family, I was asking her about why she decided to raise her kids in a city rather than on the reservation. She grew up on a reservation. And she said one of the reasons was that she wanted her kids to be out among Americans representing their culture. She wanted them to be visible, to say, we're still here. And I thought that was really extraordinary.
That was Louise Callahan, senior US reporter for The Sunday Times. You can read her piece online at thetimes.com. Just search for Who Still Counts as Native American in 2026. And to see more of the paper's coverage of the 250th anniversary of American independence, do have a go at the Spin the Wheel feature in our news archive, uncovering hidden gems from the paper's long history of reporting on America. The producer and sound designer today was Dave Creasy. The executive producers were Sophie McNulty and Edward Drummond. We'll be back as usual tomorrow. Do join us then.